Have you ever noticed that you can have two sincere people who open the same Bible, read the very same prophetic passages, and walk away with completely different conclusions? And what's interesting is that both of them believe that they're following the scriptures. I've wondered about that, not because I believe that scripture is confusing, but because I believe that God is not the author of confusion. So, how do sincere people arrive at such different interpretations? Well, that question becomes the beginning of this investigation. The longer I followed and thought about the question, the more I began to realize that we may actually be starting in the wrong place. Most conversations begin by asking, what does this symbol mean? That's a fair question. But before we ask what a symbol means, shouldn't we be asking something else first? Like, who has the authority to define it? If we begin with the wrong authority, then we really shouldn't be surprised when we arrive at different conclusions. So before we even begin to investigate a single prophetic symbol, let's answer one foundational question. Who determines the meaning of prophetic symbols? Let's follow the evidence. Let's imagine that you're reading through the book of Daniel or Revelation, Zechariah, and you come across a beast, maybe a horn, a woman, a dragon, and immediately your mind asks, what does this represent? That's probably the same place and the same thing that would happen to me. But after sitting with that particular question, there was another one that slowly began to emerge. Who has the authority to define it? Throughout history, people have looked to scholars, teachers, tradition, history, even current events to explain biblical symbols. Some of the conclusions agree, many of them don't. So, how do we determine which interpretation is trustworthy? Rather than beginning with our conclusions, let's begin where every investigation should begin, and that is with the testimony of Scripture itself. So before we hear from our first witness, I want to settle one question. Here it is. How do we know when we've reached a conclusion that we can trust? When you think about any investigation that you've ever seen or heard, if only one person is telling the story, then you're naturally going to wonder if anybody else saw the same thing. That's not because one witness doesn't have any value. It's because consistent testimony tends to build confidence. And that's true in everyday life. So shouldn't it also be true when we study the scriptures? If we have a passage that appears to teach something, we want to know, does the rest of scripture agree? Or are we building entire doctrines on isolated examples or isolated texts? For this investigation, we're going to examine multiple witnesses before we reach a conclusion. We're not looking for the newest interpretation. We're not looking for the most popular interpretation. We're not even looking for the interpretation that sounds the most convincing. We're looking for consistent testimony. Because if Scripture repeatedly says the same thing, our confidence should grow. If it doesn't, then the investigation needs to stay open. This is going to require patience and it's going to require humility. Because sometimes the most faithful answer isn't, here's what I think. Sometimes the most faithful answer is, I don't know yet. Because investigations, now listen, aren't strengthened by certainty alone, they're strengthened by evidence. So before we draw a conclusion, let's go ahead and hear from our first witness. Our first witness is Daniel. The setting couldn't be more dramatic. King Nebuchadnezzar is receiving a very troubling dream. He knows the interpretation matters. He knows that it means something, but no one in his kingdom can explain it. The magicians can't, the astrologers can't, the wise men can't. Every human source of wisdom has failed. Now, I want you to put yourself in Daniel's place. What would you do? Would you begin by offering possibilities? Would you compare the dream to history? Would you speculate? Watch what Daniel does. Before Daniel interprets anything, notice that he prays. He asks God for mercy. He asks God to reveal the mystery. Don't rush past that part. Daniel doesn't begin with interpretation. He begins with dependence. Then something remarkable happens. God reveals the mystery. Only after God reveals it does Daniel explain it. And the order matters. Daniel doesn't create the interpretation, he receives it. Daniel chapter 2, beginning at verse 27. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king has demanded, cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king? But there is a God in heaven that reveals secrets and makes known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. The dream and the visions of your head upon your bed are these. Now, as for you, O king, the thoughts came into your mind upon your bed, what should come to pass hereafter. And he that reveals secrets makes known to you what shall come to pass. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that you might know the thoughts of your heart. Do you hear Daniel? Notice where Daniel is placing the credit. It's not on himself. It's not on his wisdom. He points directly to God. The interpretation belongs to the one who revealed the mystery. That raises a very important question. Was Daniel simply an exceptional prophet? Or is this the pattern Scripture follows whenever God gives symbolic revelation? Well, let's keep investigating. This time, Daniel himself is receiving a symbolic vision. He sees 4 great beasts rise from the sea. The vision is unlike anything Daniel has ever seen before. And this time, Daniel doesn't immediately understand what he's looking at. That may be one of the most encouraging moments in the entire book. Even Daniel needed an explanation. So what does he do? Daniel chapter 7, beginning at verse 15. And it reads, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit in the midst of my body, and the visions of my head, they troubled me. So I came near unto one of them that stood by and asked him the truth of all this. So he told me and made me know the interpretation of the things. Don't miss what just happened. Daniel didn't invent the meaning. He asked. Now, let's listen to the answer. These great beasts, which are four kings. There it is. The symbol and the interpretation. Notice the order. The vision comes first. The explanation follows. Where does the explanation come from, though? It doesn't come from Daniel. It comes from heaven. Let's continue. Because later in the same chapter, another symbol requires explanation. And Daniel asks again. And once again, the interpretation is given. Daniel's method hasn't changed. He's not speculating. He seeks the explanation God provides. Now, I want you to pause for a minute. We've heard Daniel testify twice, two different prophetic experiences, but it's the same investigative method. That isn't an isolated event anymore. It's becoming a pattern. But a careful investigator doesn't stop there. Another servant of God is given a prophetic vision. This time, the witness is John. John the Revelator. Who's that writing? John the Revelator. And like Daniel, John is shown symbols that are describing future events. He sees a seven-headed beast. He sees a woman, 10 horns. This imagery, it's powerful. And the question is the same. Who explains it? Let's hear John's testimony. Revelation chapter 17, verse 7. And the angel said unto me, wherefore did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. Notice the words. He said, I will tell you. John isn't left to invent the meaning. He isn't expected to guess. The explanation is given to him, and then something remarkable is going to happen. One symbol after another, the interpretation follows. Let's look at a few examples of this. Revelation 17, verse 12, the 10 horns are identified. Revelation 17:15, the waters are identified. Revelation 17:18, the woman is identified. Again, it's the same order. Symbols first, interpretation second. And once again, the interpretation comes from God. At this point, both Daniel and John are telling the same story. Different centuries, different visions, but the same method. So now we have another question. Does this pattern continue beyond prophetic visions? Well, let's hear from one final witness. We've heard from Daniel. We've heard from the interpreting angel. We've heard from John. And each witness has testified to the same pattern. Symbols revealed, the interpretation is given. At this point in the investigation, those questions that are coming up as we're going through this information, leave them in the comments below so that we can come back and address those comments in future investigations. Now we're going to hear from the one who gave the message in the first place, Jesus. You know, throughout his ministry, he often taught using parables. Those are stories that are filled with symbolic language. Some people understood and others didn't. Here's the question. When his disciples didn't understand the symbols contained in the parables, what did Jesus do? Did he tell them, well, just make something up? Did he encourage them to choose the explanation that seemed most reasonable? That's kind of how we deal with prophecy today. Let's hear his testimony. Matthew chapter 13, verses 10 and 11. And the disciples came unto him and said, why do you speak unto them in parables? And he answered and said unto them, because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. Notice the question. Even the disciples recognize that the symbolisms, these parables, required an explanation. But Jesus's response is interesting because he doesn't tell them to guess. He begins to explain to them. Just a few moments later, he gathers the disciples, calls them together privately, and then he does something that should permanently shape how we approach biblical symbols. Let's listen to his testimony, verse 36 through 43. Then Jesus sent the multitudes away and went into the house, and his disciples came unto him, saying, declare unto us the parable of the tares of the field. So he answered and said unto them, he that sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels. As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of this world. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth, and then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. He's explaining it. But you have to allow the scripture to speak. Don't rush through it. Notice what Jesus is doing. The field is identified. The good seed is identified. The tares are identified. The enemy is identified. The harvest is identified. The reapers are identified. One symbol after another, Jesus provides the interpretation. Now, pause there for a minute because that deserves a second look. The author explains his own symbols. If there was ever a question about who has the authority to define symbolic language, Jesus answers it himself. The explanation belongs to the one who gives the message, not to the audience, not to tradition, not even to the disciples, them or us. The author explains his own symbolisms. That may be one of the most important observations in this entire investigation. We've now heard from 4 witnesses: Daniel, the interpreting angel, John, and lastly, Jesus. Different centuries, different audiences, different circumstances. But what they have consistently shown us is this: every time Scripture presents symbolic revelation, the interpretation comes from God. The witness receives it. The witness reports it. The witness doesn't create it. And notice what has happened to our original question. When the investigation began, we asked, who has the authority to determine the meaning of prophetic symbols? Now the witnesses have answered. And because they've answered consistently, our investigation moves to a different question. And it's not, what do I think this symbol means? But has God already explained somewhere in the Scripture the meaning of the symbol? That will change the way we approach every prophetic passage. So instead of beginning with speculation, we begin with investigation. Instead of searching for some creative interpretation, or, as is common today, a download, we search for God's own testimony. That's a completely different starting point. And I believe it's the starting point that Scripture itself has been showing us all along. So we've reached the end of our investigation. So let's return to the question that opened the case. Who determines the meaning of prophetic symbols? When we began, there were a lot of different possible answers. We had tradition, we had history, we had current events, we had popular teachers, we had personal opinion, but we agreed not to begin with our assumptions. We agreed to begin with witnesses. At this point, the evidence has become pretty difficult to ignore. The authority to define prophetic symbols belongs to the one who gave them, not because we've declared it to be true, but because the witnesses consistently testify to it in the Scriptures. Now, that doesn't mean that every prophetic question has already been answered. It doesn't mean every sincere student of Scripture will immediately agree on every detail. That's not the point of this conversation. But it does give us a trustworthy place to begin. So the next time you encounter a prophetic symbol, don't begin by asking, what do I think this means? Begin with a totally different question. Has God already explained this somewhere in Scripture? If the answer is yes, our responsibility isn't to improve his interpretation, it's to discover it. If the answer is no, then faithful investigation requires something many of us may find difficult: patience. There's a difference between what Scripture reveals and what we assume. And good investigators learn to know the difference. They don't force the evidence to speak, they allow it to speak. And when it does, they follow wherever it leads. And I believe that that's exactly what Scripture has been teaching us through these witnesses, not merely how to understand one prophetic symbol, but how to approach all prophetic symbols. And I think that's the real discovery in this investigation. So before we close the case, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. Every investigation, remember, begins with questions. Good investigations don't end because someone finally had an opinion. They end because the evidence has spoken. That's been our goal from the very beginning, not to defend a tradition, not to promote a system, not even to persuade, simply to ask, what has Scripture actually testified? And then to follow that testimony wherever it leads. And if today's investigation has encouraged you to approach prophecy by first asking how Scripture explains its own symbols, then we've accomplished exactly what we set out to do. Because the greatest safeguard against misunderstanding prophecy may not be finding a better interpreter. It may be learning to let the Scripture interpret itself. Thank you for taking the time to join this investigation with me. And if this conversation challenged the way you've approached prophetic symbols, I'd love to hear what stood out to you the most. What piece of testimony made you stop and think? Leave it in the comments below. Your observations often become the starting point for future investigations. So until the next time, keep investigating, keep comparing Scripture with Scripture, and wherever the evidence leads, follow it. The case is closed, but the investigations continue. See you next time.